Hey, welcome to everyone. Oh my goodness. We're off to a rip-roaring start here because my my camera is is frozen. Um, let's see here. Well, normally we do FT monthly, and this month we're not doing that. We're doing something else. So I'm going to bring on Tim, and I'm going to fix my camera. Tim,
Yeah.
welcome.
Hey.
Why don't I'm gonna fix my camera? So why don't you let people know what's going on here?
Yeah, you bet. Well, look, yesterday, in case you were underneath a rock and you didn't hear what was going on, Donald Trump, President Donald J. Trump, was convicted in a court in New York, in Manhattan, and he could face jail time. Now, I've been following this courtroom trial. It wasn't televised, but I've been following commentary on it from both sides almost every single day that it's been going on. And I was under the impression that there is no way that Donald Trump's going to get convicted. I thought surely there's going to be one juror who is not going to put up with this. To my surprise and many others' surprise, that didn't happen. And it seems to me to be a biased mess and a political hit job. And we're going to talk about why we think that's the case. And we're also going to bring on an attorney to talk about, because, Josh and I, we love to talk about law. We follow it closely. I like to think that I know I'm smart enough to have an intelligent conversation with most people, but I'm not an expert. I'm not an attorney. Neither is Josh. So I know a guy who is going to be joining us. He's an attorney, and he's never voted for Trump in the past. And we'll let him explain where he might be at these days, especially after what happened yesterday. But with that said, before we do anything else, I want to give a quick shout out to Mead Ammo, Mead Industries. You can find them at meadammo.com. And if you need ammo for apologetics purposes or theological purposes, well, freethinkingministries.com has your back. But if you need ammo for your next hunt or your next 3-gun competition, in fact, I just had a 3-gun competition yesterday, had a blast. Literally. Well, if that's the case, if you've got a 3-gun competition coming up, well, meadammo.com has your back. Now, I've got to tell you, I've been competing in the sport of 3-gun competitions for several years now. Now, look, I make no claims to be the next John Wick or anything like that. But, I might be slightly better than average. But it's my favorite hobby. I absolutely love to shoot guns, to shoot paper targets, and to shoot that steel target. Nothing brings joy to my ears more than that boom, ting. Love that sound. But I got to tell you, I've recently made the switch to Mead Ammo. And thus far, including the entire competition yesterday, I've had 0 failures. Now, maybe shooting targets isn't your thing. Maybe you like to hunt. My son is a hunting guide up in Montana, and he's also committed to using nothing but Mead ammo for his hunts. And not only that, I've gotten to know the owners of this company and some of their employees. They love Jesus and take apologetics and good theology seriously. So make sure to give these folks your business. Check out meadammo.com and order your freedom seeds today. That's meadammo.com, meadammo.com. Thanks. Josh, take it away.
All right. I am back and not frozen anymore. So
It's good to see you moving.
Yeah, as some people know, I do a monthly show here called FT Monthly, where I break down cultural things that happen. I was going to talk about the Pope. I was going to talk about Pride Month coming up. And then the news dropped yesterday, and we got on the phone with one another and said, this is probably the most pertinent cultural thing that's actually happened in the last month. And so as we were discussing yesterday, one of the things that came to my mind was that there are multiple levels to this issue. There's at least three levels. There's probably more, but I'm going to boil it down to three. There's the legal level, the political level, and the moral level. There's a lot of immorality going on in the midst of this case, but that doesn't necessarily mean illegality.
Mhm.
As Christians, how should we respond? But we
Yeah.
want to analyze the legal issues first, and you and I are not legal specialists, but we do have a friend, a mutual friend. I knew him actually independently from you when they lived in Omaha, and then they moved back to Kearney, and it is Nick Norton. I'm going to bring Nick on stage here. Hi, Nick.
Nick,
Thanks for
Hello.
joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me this afternoon.
you know, I'll just say I wanted to have you on the show many times in the past, and it's an honor to finally get you here. I want you to introduce yourself, but before you do that, I just want to say this guy is an awesome attorney. He's an awesome Christian, and he takes both things quite serious. He takes his theology seriously, but he also sometimes looks like a Viking. And so it's pretty awesome. But anyway, Nick, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the kind words and the Viking comparison, frankly. I would never call myself an expert at anything. I am an attorney, however, and I've been practicing law I'm in my 12th year this year. Most of my practice has been in the courtroom. The last few years, I've focused much more on international business, but thankfully, I work with startups who are okay with a Viking beard. So I have gotten away with this for the last 2 years, and I'm pretty happy about that. In addition to the law, as you said, I love theology. I started studying last spring at William Tennent Theological Seminary, which was a fantastic experience. My family's in the process of moving. We're kind of in a transitionary period of life right now. And so I did withdraw from Tennent and have plans to enroll at Lipscomb University in Nashville this fall to continue my Master of Divinity. And yeah, like I said, I hope I can offer something of value today. I am very cognizant of what's going on in politics because it touches every arena of our daily lives. I don't consider myself someone who's particularly interested in being involved in politics. But this case and the news coverage, all of the pundits talking about what happened and whether it should have happened or shouldn't have happened, it's hard to ignore this moment in our national history. And I think this will have implications that reverberate for decades in our country. So glad to have a chance to come and talk about it with you guys.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, Nick. We really appreciate it. Like Tim said, neither him nor I are lawyers or legal experts. And there's a lot of people to listen to on this issue. I mean, it's probably the thing people are going to be talking about today on YouTube, on news stations everywhere, because of how late the news broke yesterday with the verdict. So one of the things that you could say is that this, regardless of whether or not it was a well-tried or well, a well coordinated case, it has taken on both sides a political overtone, and there was no way to avoid that. So one of the questions that I think we wanted to ask is, it seems like there are people on the left that are cheering for this verdict. There are people on the right that are castigating the verdict, and then there are people that are saying, "Oh, it's all political. The law system worked as it should be. People are just sensationalizing it." If we are able to strip the veneer of the political, which we can't do completely, but if we do it and just look at the legal analysis, this is why we brought you on. Like, what are some things that you would tell people if the person wasn't Donald Trump, if the case wasn't as well known, and all the other facts though are the same, legally speaking, how would you analyze this case?
Well, as you kind of mentioned there at the outset, it's impossible to purely separate this out from the politics, and I think that the number one criticism that so many people have had has nothing to do with what happened in that courtroom, what the judge's rulings were. It's everything to do with the concern that there's been an abuse of the legal process to bring about political goals. And so setting that aside is difficult, because if this person that was accused of these crimes and went through this trial was not Donald Trump, I think it would be reasonable for someone to think we wouldn't be having the conversation, because there would be nothing to discuss. The charges probably wouldn't have been brought. What makes this so interesting from a purely legal standpoint is the structure of the charges and how they were brought. I am not an attorney in New York. I'm not deeply studied in New York statutes. I followed along when the charges were filed in this case, and honestly kind of scratched my head about how this all got put together. So the initial I can't even get to underline yet. On its face, the charges against President Trump were 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree, which is a Class E felony in New York under New York state law. That's the lowest class of felony. But to really get at what does that charge mean, it's based on a misdemeanor charge that is effectively the same charge. It's just not intended to cover up a crime. That becomes important because the underlying charge basically amounts to if you had the intent to defraud someone and you falsified business records with that intent, then you would be guilty of falsifying business records, which is a misdemeanor under New York law. If you've committed that and it was with the intent to commit another crime or to conceal that another crime had been committed, then it becomes a felony. And so I think, just from a purely legal perspective, the first thing that should concern anyone looking at this and trying to determine were the charges valid, should they have gone forward in the first place, is the statute of limitations had already run out by the time these charges were filed on the misdemeanor. There's a longer statute of limitations for felonies, and that's why they were able to still bring the charge. But the structure of the statute here doesn't seem to support that in many legal commentators' opinions, and I would share that opinion. If the commission of the misdemeanor is an element of the felony and the misdemeanor is already barred by the statute of limitations, I think that would have been the easiest place to cut this off and say these charges are barred and they can't go forward. So that's the first place that I would kind of point out to anyone trying to familiarize themselves with why is this a big deal. The second thing is really just the complexity of these charges. So the state had to prove that President Trump acted with the intent to defraud, and that intent to defraud included the intent to defraud for the purpose of committing or covering up an independent crime. And that independent crime, as charged here, was a violation of New York election law that required a conspiracy to influence an election by unlawful means. That is a very, very, very rich statement when it comes to what do all these elements mean. Intent is typically one of the hardest things to prove in any trial setting, because the only person who truly knows the intent is the person who had it. Sometimes that person doesn't even know their intent very well. And so having three separate intent elements at three different levels makes this just an absolute nightmare to get to the bottom of. And I'll pause there to see if that's what you're looking for. There's a lot more on that, but that's kind of my general thoughts when I look at it from a high level.
Yeah. So when you're looking at it from a high level, you would say, and it's hard to not get into the moral basis, because it's kind of a disgusting and despicable case, because the hush money is to pay someone off because you had an affair with them, right? And they call it hush money or NDA or whatever they want to call it. I know the NDA is the legal term, but that's what's being alleged as violating the campaign finance law, correct? Or am I misreading what was going on? Okay.
I mean, effectively, what the state of New York claimed was that this $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels was falsified in 34 different places. That they tried to cover up that payment. I believe there were 11 falsified invoices, 12 falsified general ledger entries, and 11 falsified checks, according to the state of New York. And then they went forward to make their case that the purpose of those falsified records was to commit or conceal another crime, including state and federal election laws and potentially tax laws.
Okay. And so I heard someone say this the other day. I can't remember who it was because I've been listening to a whole bunch of people, but I guess generally speaking, Trump's case was, well, my lawyer, I told him to take care of it in any legal way. And if he did it illegally, that's on him. That was kind of the case that they were making. Do you find that to be the case? Is that what they were doing? Did you follow along with that?
You know, I followed some of it, and I'll confess, I did not follow this trial closely on a day-to-day basis. I was generally aware of what was going on. I dug into it when the charges were first filed, and I've kind of checked in throughout the process. I think that's an approach. I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach. I think that, in my opinion, had I been trying this case, I would have focused more on the who cares portion of what was done, because and to be clear, I'm not going to sit here and say that what President Trump did was okay or morally good or right. I make no excuses for him in that. But at the end of the day, the question is, was it illegal? And, you know, there has to be something more, in my opinion, than I paid someone to keep quiet so that they wouldn't ruin my election chances. I can't think of any politician who doesn't do everything that they do for the purpose of trying to get elected. Mm-hmm. And so really it comes down to where their unlawful means employed. Had I been putting this defense together, and given the personality of the defendant, maybe this was impossible. But I think I would have taken the approach of who cares? Yeah, let's say I did all that. Mm-hmm. What crime was it? What crime was I committing and concealing? That's where I would have focused the defense. I don't think the defense did that. They spent more time going after whether you could believe witnesses and focusing, in my mind, on what were points that probably the jury, assuming they're made up of average U.S. persons who have, you know, some idea of what's happened in the world over the last 7 or 8 years. They already have opinions about Trump's character. They already have opinions about whether they think he does good things or bad things. They already have opinions about his credibility. It's impossible not to with that public of a figure. So I would have taken a different approach, but I think that is an approach. I think it's appropriate. It obviously didn't win the day.
Mm-hmm. Tim, did you have something?
Well, I would like to, I guess, touch on, there's multiple different problems that we had in the trial. It's got people all riled up. From their star witness, Cohen, being caught lying on the stand under oath. His credibility seems shot, but the judge, I don't think the judge, again, it wasn't televised, so just getting reports here, but I don't think the judge said strike that from the record, and basically said you can choose to believe it or not. Am I right about that, Josh? Am I summarizing that correctly? And if so, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Nick.
Yeah, I don't, like you said, I don't know what was said in the courtroom. So, and maybe Nick does, maybe he doesn't, but
okay.
There have been people that have said, "Oh, the judge operated fully exactly how a judge ought to," and then there were people that said he didn't. The bigger concern for me is in the jury deliberation instructions.
Yeah, I want to get to that.
We want to get to. But concerning Tim's question, Nick, did you hear anything on that count?
Yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon. We would like to think that no one ever lies under oath, and then when you go into court, you're always getting the full truth from every witness. That's not real life. And so, if someone were to get caught lying on the stand, there's potential consequences for that person in the form of perjury charges that sometimes get brought. Often they don't. Depends on the judge, depends on the court, on the seriousness of the falsehood that's uttered under oath. But what would be normal and what was done in this case is to instruct the jury that their job is to assess the credibility of the witnesses. And with Cohen specifically, when we get into the jury instructions, there's actually several pages of limiting instructions related to different testimonies from different witnesses and what it may be considered for and what it may not be considered for. There's also a section in the jury instructions about Cohen as an accomplice and what impact that has on his testimony, including a limitation to the jury that they can't consider Cohen's testimony on its own as sufficient to have a conviction of Trump. Only if it was corroborated by other evidence could they consider it. Everything that Cohen said goes to his credibility. And so the system really is built to allow the jury to give appropriate weight or a lack of weight to testimony that doesn't appear to be credible.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think about the just the politicization of the entire thing? So you've got this politicized prosecutor and Alvin Bragg who ran on, hey, we're going to find something to get Trump with. You know, that was what he was running on. It wasn't on, hey, we're out for justice. It was, hey, we got to get Trump. So you got a politicized prosecutor in Alvin Bragg who's bringing a politicized case before a politicized judge who obviously, he was a donor to the Biden campaign, and his daughter is a political activist for the Democrat Party. He seems to be not the most fair-minded judge. And then a politicized jury in the heart of a deep blue New York State in Manhattan, where I think Trump only won like 5% of the vote. How can this be a jury of his peers? It just seems like we're wandering into Banana Republic territory. And that's what concerns me. It seems like this is, Trump has been accused of election interference by the left every day. It seems to me that this is a blatant and most extreme version of political interference or election interference that's ever happened in this country. It sure seems that way. And I know a lot of people are feeling that. What do you think about just how political this entire trial has become?
I hate it. Mm-hmm. Absolutely hate it. You know, whether they were good charges or bad charges, it's kind of secondary to why were they filed and then what happened afterwards. How has this been used? I mean, we've been living through this trial as a nation for what, eight weeks. That's a long time. Now we'll see whether it backfires, whether that was a successful strategy for those who put that together or not. I don't know. One thing I do want to touch on though is with regard to Judge Merchant and whether he was biased, how much he was biased, whether his rulings were appropriate or inappropriate. It's hard to know where the truth lies there. There's certainly been some reports that have been concerning to me with regard to his rulings or his behavior. But I do think it's important to remember that the way that our judicial system is built in this country, that's what the appellate process, that's what it exists to address. It is supposed to root out and remedy any discrepancies or failures of the system procedurally or factually or legally at the trial level and remedy those things. It's unfortunate in this case because of the timeline, how long it's going to take to get through the appellate process in the normal course of events, the fact that this is a active presidential candidate. The appeals will not likely be done prior to the general election. That I think underscores that the system probably never contemplated something like this happening.
Yeah. So, no, it seems to me that, these 34 felony counts would not have been brought against anybody else unless his name was Donald J. Trump in 2024. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, along with that idea, Nick, as you followed this case, did it seem like a serious case? And by serious, I mean, legally speaking, as you looked at it, like, oh, people are taking the law seriously here, or did it seem like a frivolous case? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I don't know that we can say that it was a frivolous case. I think there's a pretty vast chasm between, is it a good case and is it frivolous? Somewhere in the middle, I think it was improperly motivated from what I could see. It seemed more like a political hit job with a lot of photo ops along the way than it did a quote unquote serious case. I mean, when you think about what cases you've seen that involve fraud, you're typically looking at a case against somebody like Madoff, that there's been a whole lot of people that have been very seriously damaged because somebody was a huckster and screwed them over, right?
Yeah.
Here, defraud, there had to be an intent to defraud on Trump's part in order for any of this to go through. And yet it appears that, and this may be a function of how New York courts have defined the word defraud, but it has a pretty normal and accepted meaning. In general terms, in a fraud case, in order for someone to be found guilty of fraud, there has to be a showing that someone's been damaged.
There's a victim.
There's a victim. They've been damaged, and they've been damaged as a result of relying on the misrepresentation that was made. Black's Law Dictionary defines defraud as to deprive a person of property or any interest, estate, or right by fraud, deceit, or artifice. And in contrast to that, the jury instructions on page 29, so kind of buried in the middle, the judge instructed the jury here that the intent to defraud was not constricted to an intent to deprive another of property or money and can extend beyond economic concerns. So right off the bat, when we talk about seriousness of these alleged and now convicted crimes, there's no victim here. They've broadened the definition of defraud to basically mean do anything misleading, whether there's a victim or not. And if there had been a victim, it would have necessarily been the voters, right? We were the ones that would have been led astray, except for there was not a single voter in this country that I'm aware of that would have even known these records were falsified until after the election. So even if there was, President Trump trying to hoodwink us all, it didn't work. We didn't have the opportunity to rely on those falsified business records to make any sort of a decision. And that's where it falls apart for me when you start talking about, was this a serious case or was it a politically motivated case? I think it's very clearly politically motivated.
Well, I want to get to some of the questions in the live chat here soon. But before we get there, well, okay, let's start with Mind Trap here. It says, can you speak to the lack of cameras in the trial? Why wasn't it on TV like OJ's?
I don't know New York law and practice on that. I can tell you generally there's been a division throughout the country between some courts wanting to allow cameras for greater transparency, others not allowing cameras. I doubt that that had anything to do with the profile of this case and was probably more of a local practice. I've never been on camera while I was in court. I don't think I'd really want to be.
All right. Right. All right. Let's go to another one. I do wish, I mean, if any courtroom and trial should be on TV, I wish this one would have been, because everybody cares about it and would like to have seen how it was.
Well, and if the idea is that the American people have been defrauded, like you said,
right.
Perhaps a more public trial. Chris says, and I think this gets even, maybe you could talk even further about the jury instructions here, because this question kind of gets to that. It says, is it true that the judge said that the jury didn't need to be unanimous on what crime had been committed? I take it that the jury needs to agree on that. And I've heard the similar things about the jury instructions, that they needed to be unanimous that a crime was committed, but that they could choose between one of three crimes. Is that the case?
It is, and it's an oddity to me. I'll confess I've never seen anything quite like that. I know that there's some commentators out there that are saying that that's never allowed. You have to pick a crime. The jury has to be unanimous that a particular thing occurred. The confusion, I think, that surrounds that is when people talk about that in general terms. Sorry, my phone's ringing here. When people talk about that in general terms, they are thinking, well, he was convicted of something and they don't even know what they convicted him of. That's not quite how the jury instructions work. So as I mentioned before, on the intent to defraud, the judge instructed the jury on what that meant. But effectively, he would, in order to be found guilty, the jury had to find that Trump had acted with the intent to defraud, that includes an intent to commit another crime or to aid and or conceal in the commission thereof, and that person makes or causes a false entry in the business records of an enterprise. And I'm mostly reading that from the page 27 of the jury instructions. On page 29 of the jury instructions, the judge goes a little further on that with regard to the intent to commit or conceal another crime, saying that, quote, the people must prove an intent to commit another crime or to aid or conceal the commission thereof. They need not prove that the other crime was in fact committed, aided, or concealed. And then, as we kind of peel back the onion here, the next 5 or 6 pages of the jury instructions talk about what the other crime was that was alleged by the prosecution's office. The other crime was alleged to be a violation of New York election law. Generally, the New York election law that was at issue prescribes the conspiracy of 2 or more individuals to promote or prevent the election to office of a candidate by, quote, unlawful means. Then we get to the next layer of what are unlawful means. And that's where the judge instructed the jury, you need not be unanimous as to what those unlawful means were. So at that layer of the onion, once we've peeled back the intent to have the intent to do the intent to conspiracy, I mean, all of these things, we get to what were the unlawful means that were the foundation of the underlying crime. So then we look at, okay, those unlawful means have to be another crime. And there were 3 theories that the prosecution put forth as to what the unlawful means were that violated the New York election law. One of those was violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act related to the amount of contributions given by a person or contributions given by a corporation. The second was falsification of other business records. In other words, other false entries with intent to defraud. And the third was violation of tax laws. State and local laws in New York provide that it's unlawful to submit any false or fraudulent information in connection with the tax return. Federal law provides essentially that it's unlawful to submit anything that's fraudulent or false as to any material matter. And so those were the three things: the tax laws, the business records, and the Federal Campaign Act, that the judge said, you don't have to decide which one of these were unlawful means. You just have to find that there was a conspiracy to get himself elected, and it was by unlawful means, whatever unlawful means you decide. So I know that's confusing. That's why there's a whole lot of people talking about this, but does that make a little more sense?
It makes, well, the way you've described it, it makes sense. To me, it doesn't make sense if I'm on the jury in a lot of ways, because it's very confusing, and it feels built towards an end.
Conviction.
Like it feels like it's constructed to give you the least amount of reasonable doubt as possible. Say, well, I agree that maybe I don't know, maybe it's over the amount, but I disagree. It's this. Well, I think it is over the amount, and you could have 12 juries decide unanimously that three of the three crimes were committed, but 4 decide this, 4 decide that one, 4 decide that one. It seems very convoluted and built towards a conviction. Like we're wanting to have some sort of verdict here. Is that what it feels like to you, or am I just confirmation bias here, or is that?
I'm still working out how I feel about this, if I'm completely honest. It could be because it kind of lends itself to I'm sure he did something illegal. And if they can get to that point where I'm sure he did something illegal, it's not a big leap to put the onion back together and convict on 34 felony counts. It's frustrating from the standpoint of not having that preserved in the record for appeal, of knowing what specific factual findings the jury made, because it would have been helpful to the administration of justice here to have specific findings of what were the unlawful means, what was a conspiracy committed. Now, one thing I didn't look at, if there was a verdict form, I haven't seen it. Maybe there were more specific questions in a verdict form. I haven't heard anyone talking about that either, so I really don't know what level of detail they went into. But yeah, I think it's, on the one hand, very odd that you would leave that much out in the open, up for interpretation. On the other hand, if the underlying basis, if I said, Tim tried to rob me, and he kicked down my door and held a gun to my head, and called my wife names, I guess that last part wouldn't be illegal, but let's pretend it is. Would it really matter which one of those things were true if he did in fact rob me? If you commit 3 separate felonies in the furtherance of taking my stuff, which is the felony you're being charged with, I don't know how much that makes a difference to me. You could believe that Tim kicked down my door and called my wife names, but not put a gun to my head. Or you could say, yeah, he probably did kick down the door and hold a gun to your head, but he would never call your wife names. At the end of the day, he walked out with my TV. Does it matter what means he used to get my TV? He's not being charged for those 3 things. He's being charged for taking the TV by unlawful means. So when I think about it like that, I think, I don't know, maybe if this wasn't so ephemeral and confusing, I wouldn't have a problem with, pick your storyline.
But couldn't that go to even reasonable doubt though? Like, let's to go upon your example here. Let's say 4 of us don't believe that Tim kicked in your door. Well, then that gives reasonable doubt to the fact that, well, maybe you gave Tim your TV and now you're wanting it back and you're the one. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, if you start to doubt one of them, you could start to doubt all of them. But if you prove that he kicked down your door beyond a reasonable doubt, then the other things seem to fall in line to say, well, 12 of us think he kicked down his door, which means it seems pretty clear that if you kick down someone's door, you're not going to go there and borrow the TV. You're going to take it. I don't know if that makes sense, but
It makes sense, but I don't think that's how this is constructed. It would be more along the lines of all 12 of us agree that he took your TV. And we agree that it was unlawful. We just disagree about which unlawful acts he did while he was taking your TV.
But doesn't that mean that, so out of the 12 members of the jury, it seems to me like you're saying, well, all of them agree that he did something wrong, but you could have 4 of them think it was one thing that he did wrong, 4 of them think another thing was what he did wrong, and 4 of them think another thing, and they don't all have to agree on what he did wrong. And so let's just convict him.
Well, I think it's different than sorry, now we're getting to discussion here. This is a good discussion, but the thing that they agree he did wrong was take the TV, right?
Right.
And what means he led up to it. So
Yeah.
so the specific conviction of this case, bringing it back to the real life case, is election interference. Is that the
It's a conspiracy to influence the election by unlawful means.
okay? But influencing the election itself isn't unlawful because you can do that through lawful means.
Correct.
So I guess that's kind of where my example with the TV comes. You could get someone's TV through lawful means. So we're going back to the example. So they're not necessarily agreeing that what he did was unlawful. It only becomes unlawful if he did it through unlawful means. Is that?
It is. And yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I think that gets so confusing because the president wasn't on trial for violating the New York election law. He wasn't on trial for any of the alleged unlawful means that he used to violate the New York election law. He was on trial for having the intent to commit something to defraud someone, including the intent to commit a crime, which was the intent to commit a conspiracy by unlawful means. So none of the underlying crimes were never charged. No prosecutors prosecuted him for any federal election campaign violations. No one chose to prosecute him for tax law violations. No one prosecuted him for any of the misdemeanor business record falsifications. The statute of limitations closed on those. So the underlying crimes here were not proven by any legal standard. They didn't have to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the jury was figuring out this, squishy. That's not a legal term. But figuring out this squishy idea of, did he have the intent to do bad things illegally?
Wow. So if you can get there, that you believe he had the intent, then things start to fall into place.
Yeah, you can say what you want about Alvin Bragg. Can't say he's not creative.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So I had some communication with our friend Mike Lacona earlier today, and he was telling me that he's sick and tired of the media being so biased one way or the other. Most places, let's just be honest, are completely biased toward the left. But yeah, we can find right-leaning news outlets as well. So one thing that Mike started doing is following a George Washington University law professor, a legal expert named Jonathan Turley. And one reason why he started following him is because he's a guy that would not vote for Trump at least in the past. And he was at the trial every single day in the courtroom, following it closely and giving his thoughts on the matter on a regular basis. And it seems to me that a little bit that I've looked at it now just today, that he believes that Trump's right to a fair trial was violated. Now, again, like you, Nick, he's an attorney who never voted for Trump. And so that's another reason why I think you have a little bit more weight on this, because while I would call you leaning to the conservative side of things, you've kind of been a never Trump guy, right? I hope you don't mind me telling that to our huge audience right here. But But Jonathan Turley from George Washington University was in the same boat. And he does not think that that this was a fair trial. And at the end, he said this. He said, "I am saddened by the result more for the New York legal system than for the former president. I had hoped that the jurors might redeem the integrity of a system that has been used for political purposes." And then he followed that up and said, Judge Marchand committed layers of reversible order. And following that, Ben Shapiro posted, another attorney. He said that Judge Juan Marchand gave the most bizarre set of jury instructions I've ever heard. They were designed to lead to conviction. If this isn't reversible error does not exist. Now, you might push back on Ben regarding the jury instructions, but Shapiro's at least agreeing with Turley here that there are layers of reversible error. Can you let our audience know what reversible error is, and then give your thoughts on a possible appeal and what that might look like?
Yeah, I think, thanks for asking that. I think that's an important point here. There have been several legal commentators that have said we were in the courtroom and there were layers of reversible error or repeated reversible errors by the judge. So anytime that there is a ruling that needs to be made about whether evidence comes in or it doesn't come in, or how the jury is going to be instructed, or whether there's a number of motions and kind of outside the presence of the jury things that happen in a courtroom, at every turn there, the judge will have to make a ruling. In a jury trial, it's ultimately up to the jury to decide what the facts are and apply those facts to the law. It's the judge's job to declare accurately what the law is, and to make legal and procedural rulings at every step of litigation to ensure that the jury gets a chance to consider the facts and to know the appropriate law to which they should apply those facts. And so judges make mistakes like any of us. There may be an objection that is sustained and a witness's testimony doesn't get to come in. And later, in the cold light of looking at thousands of pages of written transcripts, anyone can tell, yes, that shouldn't have been sustained. That witness should have been allowed to testify. So in every single trial, there are errors that occur. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a reversible error or not is a matter of degree. It's looking at a particular error and deciding, did this prejudice a party materially such that it's worth sending the case back and doing it over again to get it right? And so that's what, different folks talking about reversible errors, they're saying mistakes or missteps that were made during the trial that were of a serious enough nature that justice wasn't served.
Oh, yeah, thanks for that. That's I've been seeing that all over the place as well. So it's good to have some clarity on that. Another note of clarity. So say it's appealed and there are reversible errors found. Does that mean the case gets retried, or does the conviction get dismissed? Generally speaking, maybe that's too broad of a question, but
no, I think that's a reasonable question. I think that's a question a lot of people have of what happens when you appeal. So an appellate court's job is to go through and assess errors that are assigned by the party that's appealing. Most courts have a rule that if there's a plain error on the record, they can address that without anybody arguing about it. But more typically, the parties will present assignments of error, and they will have a list, and that list may be 2 things, it may be 200 things, and they say, on these 200 things, the trial court got it wrong, and on each of them, if you find any of them to be true, they're egregious enough that you should send this case back. So there's a few different things that an appellate court can do if they decide to reverse a case. Or I should say, in general, if they're reviewing a case, they can affirm the trial court, rubber stamp the whole thing, and it's done. They can affirm but modify, meaning they change some aspect of the trial court's order, but they otherwise affirm the judgment. They can reverse and remand, which means they undo the judgment of the court. They would identify the errors that they found to be egregious enough to justify the reversal, and then they send the case back to the lower court to do whatever they're going to do, and I'll touch on that in a second. And then there's a reverse and render, and that's kind of we're overturning this, and the result was so obvious that we're just going to go ahead and render the judgment that you should have rendered in the first place, and it's over. Reversing and rendering doesn't happen all that often. Typically, if there's a reversal, it's remanded to the trial court with instructions for what they're supposed to do next. And so they may be told to retry the case. It's usually a little more nuanced than that, where they'll send it back and have instructions as to how to treat a certain piece of evidence, or how the law applies in a way that it was misapplied by the trial court the first time around. Then what the trial court does with that depends on how egregious it is. And so if an appellate court looked at this and said, this entire thing was barred by the statute of limitations because there's an underlying element that is the commission of a misdemeanor, and the statute was closed on that misdemeanor charge, then they could send it back with instructions that the trial court dismiss the case, and they would have to do that. If they found, this witness should have been allowed to testify or should not have been allowed to testify, and send it back to the trial court, then the trial court can start over again and just make the correct ruling on that witness the next time around. So there's certainly cases where we'll see a trial happen. It'll go up to appeal. Something will get overturned on a procedural basis or a particular legal ruling that's not enough to dispose of the whole case. And then we go back to the trial court and we start the whole circus over again.
Which that would be one of the grounds, is that the defense wanted to bring a witness that they believed would be key to their defense, and the judge wouldn't allow that person to take the stand. So that's, I think, one of the points of appeal that they'll probably seek to move forward.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but attorneys like to argue.
Really?
Yeah, weird.
What?
I know. But,
that's why you and I get along so well, Nick. Right?
There's rarely anything that's clear cut. There's always a colorable argument that can be made on both sides of an issue. You know that.
Yeah.
And we can, no matter how good of a job the advocate arguing thinks they've done, somebody's going to disagree and have counterpoints to that. And that's how every single one of these evidentiary rulings and procedural rulings go in court proceedings in real life. And so I haven't heard of or seen anything that I'm able to say as an objective third party that is so obviously prejudicial and egregious that this must be reversed, and that'll definitely happen.
Yeah.
Too many opinions and good arguments can be made by smart people on both sides.
Mm-hmm. There have been some people that have said this should get appealed to the Supreme Court right away, which I guess it can happen. I personally don't want to see that happen, because then it's a further politicization, in my opinion, of what's happening. Let's just take it to the Supreme Court, and then people will say, well, the conservatives rule the Supreme Court, so he'll get off scot-free. And I've heard that that's not that is a very abnormal case. And even if they try, it'll get kicked back down to lower appellate courts. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, under normal circumstances, if this defendant was anyone other than Donald J. Trump, then that wouldn't even be part of the conversation. It's not happening. You go through the normal appellate channels. And so just at a very basic philosophical level, my knee-jerk reaction to that is No, he doesn't get special treatment. The justice system only works if it applies the same to everyone. And that is despite a judge that may have done things wrong, or, jurors that were confused and weren't required to make specific findings, whatever might have happened in the trial court. We all stand equal under the law. And so the caveat to that is whether the whole process was an abuse of the system to begin with, by using it for something it was never intended to be used for.
Well, I think that's the counter, is we're all supposed to stand equal under the law. And this wasn't an equal application of the law, because as we've all said, this wouldn't have happened to anybody else unless his name were Donald J. Trump. And
but I want to be clear, injustice gets thrown around a lot. In a lot of scenarios, anytime we don't like the outcome of something, we say that it was an injustice. There may have been an injustice here. I don't know. I might have opinions. I'll keep those to myself on some of the specifics. But if the system works as it's intended and the result comes out, then, as citizens of this country, I think that we have a duty to acknowledge that justice has been done, even if we don't like the outcome.
But if you think that there was injustice during the trial, then we don't have that obligation. I wouldn't do it.
Well, but then we have an appellate process to correct any actual injustice that was done. If we're talking about injustice as a bad application or an uneven application of generally applicable legal principles and protections and procedures, those are injustices. Prosecuting someone who committed a crime, allegedly, and now confirmed by a jury, committed 34 of them. If Donald Trump committed a crime and was prosecuted for those crimes and was convicted in a vacuum, setting aside the election ramifications of all of this and the politics, then that was what the justice system was supposed to do. And if the justice system made a mistake, it is the rest of the judicial system's job to remedy that mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
I would say probably over half of the country right now thinks that there was an abuse of power and injustice. Now, again, another half of the country is going to disagree, but half of the country is saying, hey, there was an abuse of power here. This is not justice. This is injustice. And so as it stands right now, people are really angry and they're hoping that the appellate process works. And that's why I think it will probably ultimately get to the Supreme Court, because I don't see, it stays in New York until then, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't see an extreme blue state, especially since we've seen these. Look, the Biden's DOJ had somebody just left Biden's DOJ to work for Bragg. There's just warning signs all over the place. So he's working with Bragg. As soon as he joins Bragg's team, 5 seconds later, here come these charges. So it just seems like it's just political, a mess all over, and that this is election interference. Not only that, Donald Trump right now is leading in the polls. If the election were at least yesterday, he wins. And so now, we can't win at the ballot box, so let's win in the jury box with a politicized trial. It just, I don't feel good about it. And I know I probably represent a good half of the country.
I think what you're getting at is why this is such a dangerous, to not have clear. So like, I'm going to agree with everything that Nick said. Personally, if Trump did a crime, I want him to be convicted of that crime, because I'm on the side of justice. And I'm not a remember the famous, hey, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose any supporters. Remember that? Yeah. I'm not that guy.
Just really quick, let me interrupt. I can't remember who I heard say this, but they said, well, if Trump did kill somebody downtown New York City, Bragg would have probably let him off, because he seems to be light on that kind of crime to everybody else. But you do this hush money stuff. going down.
I doubt that's the case, but I understand what I understand what you're saying.
It was a joke.
Yeah. So I'll agree with Nick. I'll agree with you. Like as especially as Christians, regardless of conservative whatever, we should want to see justice carried forward. And so, but this is why I think this trial and this verdict are so concerning to me, is because of the amount of polarization with it. The fact that it's so unclear is, regardless of what was right or what wasn't, like that's a big issue to me. If you're going to indict and convict a former president of the United States, I really want these things to be very, very clear and cut and dried. And this was so messy and muddy, as we've talked about. Do you see what I'm saying there, Nick? Is that something that concerns you as well, or?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that concern me about how this all happened. The reality is that in a lot of trial settings, the facts are messy. If we had perfect clarity on everything, we could do away with a jury system and, replace it with AI or robots. So I understand that yearning that, man, if this is a really big deal, I would like everything to be crystal clear. That's what the jury's there for, is to make those hard decisions. And so I think it's, I have a friend on the other side of the world who always says, we need to pay attention to the people that are out there on the pitch, which it took me a while to figure out he meant field, but
Yeah.
it's hard. It's easy to stand on the sidelines or in the stands and to criticize things. None of us on this, in this discussion were players. We didn't have anything to do with the inner workings. We didn't get to see what happened on the field or on the pitch because courtroom was, it wasn't televised. And I don't suppose any of us have the liberty to spend 2 months just sitting in a room in New York, while the rest of life goes on. So yeah, I would have loved this to have been more clear cut, but I don't know that makes this any different. I think there's just more eyes on this than a normal criminal trial where there's a lot of questions.
Maybe I should clarify a little bit. I just meant in general the charges is clear cut, not necessarily the decision, because as we talked about, that seems really, really muddy. Like if it's fraud, having the actual definition of fraud and not being redefined and those sorts of things, it would seem to me, especially like you said, no one's above the law, but I want the law to be applied clearly as far as the indictment goes. I understand there's going to be a lot of mess in the process of discovering a verdict, but at least then I can point to, okay, this is exactly what's being tried here. In fact, I would even say with Trump's other cases, I mean, he's got 3 or 4 other cases. They're more clear. The one in Florida, a lot more clear. Mishandling of classified documents, very, very clear. The one in Georgia is a little bit less clear because it's a RICO case, but still pretty clear. This one just seems so unclear that it's concerning to me that it got to this level. Does that make a little bit more sense as far as the indictment goes? Not necessarily because I don't actually, there are some people that are angry with the jury here. I don't know that I can get there because, as you said, in the jury instructions and stuff, I don't know what I would have done having sat through all of that and then get these confusing jury instructions with 11 other people. So it's not necessarily that. It's the other stuff leading up to it. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And I think it's a dangerous thing to start blaming the jurors in general. Unless there is some evidence that they engaged in jury nullification and ignored the law, they had a tough job to do in this case. They got the evidence that they got. They had the legal instructions that were given, and they had to fit those two things together. I don't know if anything improper happened in that jury room. I do think, there was comment earlier about whether this was a fair trial. I mean, that's basically impossible, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know how you have a fair and impartial jury when a former president as polarized as Donald Trump is the one that's on trial.
Well, and I think that's one of the good things that has been the norm is that political parties haven't gone after their rivals. Even when Trump, in his debate with Hillary Clinton, said you'll be in jail, well, he never pursued that. But now that everybody is, or at least on the left, is fine when they pursue Trump. And I agree with Josh. I want justice. I want truth. I also want consistency. And it drives me nuts to continue to hear Democrats say that Trump is a threat to the democracy. And after this decision, after this verdict, Biden issued a statement saying, well, that no one is above the law. And I just have a hard time swallowing that from him because, yeah, I mean, it just seems to be the case that no one is above the law except for Joe Biden. I mean, he was facing charges. He'd be facing charges right now if he would not have been ruled basically too old and senile to be able to handle court, right? And so it seems like nobody's above the law except for Joe Biden and except for his son, Hunter Biden, and except for Hillary Clinton. I mean, even James Comey back in 2016, when Hillary it was clear that she had committed a felony. Well, he was like, no, we're not going to prosecute because that's election interference. Well, now it's like, okay, we're going to give it to you, though. It seems to be a two-tiered justice system right now. And it seems like no one is above the law except for Democrats. Am I justified in those feelings and those observations?
I would revise that slightly, but importantly, what we're seeing right now may be that everyone who's at the high levels of politics has been above the law for the last 200 years,
right? Until
now. Yeah. So I'll try to be the devil's advocate here and be an optimist. There's one way to look at this to think, hey, maybe our top politicians are going to start being held accountable in a way that many Americans have wanted for a long time and felt like was completely unreachable. Yeah. So I think that's yeah. I don't know if anyone will be held to the same standard, but there's two ways to look at this. Either it's the jumping off point into a banana republic where we prosecute our political enemies, or it's the first shingle falling off of the roof that has protected political elite for as long as we've been a nation. I don't think it's the latter, but I think you could make that argument.
My concern with the shingle falling off is that there's a quick fall into an avalanche of the banana republic, even especially given, like I said, I have no problem with a former president or current president being brought up on charges that are clear, and this is why I'm so I don't know if passionate is the right word, but so concerned about where we go from here because of the polarization of this. We'll get into the political now a little bit rather than just the legal, and we'll get into some questions here too because we've stockpiled a few.
We got some good ones here.
Yeah, we've stockpiled a few. First, I want to thank you, Nick, for pushing back and for having this. This has been a great conversation. Love it. So thank you for that. But that's my concern. Is the polarization of Trump, right, wrong, or indifferent, is going to make all of these seem like political trials. And it seems like that's part of the reason we've avoided this, is to say, well, to err on the side of maintaining, decorum in our democracy, we're not going to pursue charges against other people. Whether or not that's right, the goal was we don't want to be perceived as having a banana republic, unless and be perceived as persecuting our political opponents. So we're not going to pursue things unless it's very, very clear. Unless it's very, very clear. It feels like the same thing that's been happening with the impeachment process. It used to be presidents were rarely impeached, and now it seems like every president's going to be impeached from here on out. Like someone's going to do something, we're going to do an impeachment process, and it's just kind of roll your eyes and move along. And so that's my concern. That's why I don't like it. Any comments to that before I get to some questions here? No.
I'm with you there.
Okay. All right. I think this was one of the ones you were alluding to, Nick. One of the questions about fairness says, in terms of fairness, how do you think this compares to Derek Chauvin's trial? If you remember that, that's the gentleman who, the police officer who sat on George Floyd. Guilty or not, thanks to the media, I don't think for a moment you could find an unbiased jury for this trial. I think we've kind of covered that.
I would say this would have been much more difficult to find an unbiased jury than the Chauvin trial.
Yeah. Well, you could have moved the Chauvin trial out of Minneapolis, right? That was an option, and that would have given you maybe a better. But even this, like, unless you're trying to find an even amount, even if you try to find an even amount, okay, we're going to find 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats on the jury. Right. Even that, you're not going to have. There's going to be bias.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Is there another one that I missed?
There's a lot. Yeah.
Here's one. Did we cover this one yet? Oh, how does one improve intent in general? Seems to me like that's categorically impossible, given that our minds are immaterial. And so, how would you answer that, there, Nick?
That's a good question, and it's a hard thing to prove. There's 2 different concepts of intent. There's specific intent and there's general intent. Well, I guess that doesn't even really matter for this, though. When you look at the rules of evidence, there's very specific rules that come into play in every courtroom as to what can come in as evidence. And there are protections that are built into the system that aim at weeding out the less credible, the things that a jury shouldn't even have to consider because they don't meet the minimum standard of what we would possibly find to be credible evidence. So trying to prove intent, whether it's general or specific intent, really comes down to witness testimony, corroborating actions, documents. Every now and then you might find an email that says, hey, we need to cover up these payments so that I can gain a political office by unlawful means in violation of New York election statute. But we're probably not going to find that, right? What we're more likely to find is, well, he said we needed to cover this up. And then another witness saying, well, he knew that we were falsifying the business records because he told me to make this go away. And so you have to infer intent from those circumstantial evidence, from, if there's a hole in a window and because a kid threw a baseball through it and it's a very small window on a big brick wall, the kid had the intent to throw the baseball. That'd be general intent. Whether he had the specific intent to hit the window or not might be hard to tell. Now, if you look at a wall of glass and there's a hole in it with a baseball on the other side and the kid threw it, it's pretty easy to say you wouldn't throw that through the wall of glass without the specific intent that you were going to break a window. So that might be kind of a silly illustration, but I think that's kind of how we get to assessing someone's intent.
I think that helps. I think that helps to clarify that. This isn't a question, but I thought it was a fun comment here. I think it'd be fun to have Nicholas review lawyer shows like Suits or Jag. Do you ever watch those?
Absolutely.
I've talked to some police officers that don't watch like the procedural cop shows because they're so poorly. Did you watch Suits?
Oh yeah, I think I made it through about 5 seasons of it. Love it. And Jag, I absolutely adored Jag when that was around.
Oh yeah. Compared to the regular legal processes, how would you rate them on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being completely unrealistic, 5 being hit the nail on the head.
I mean, somewhere between a 0 and 1. There are moments that are realistic in all of those shows, but a lot of times you'll hear like, well, this lead actor or actress has a cousin who's in law school, and so they found out what it's like to be in an evidence class, and then they'll throw out some specific rule that sounds really smart and has nothing to do with whatever's happening in the show. There are some shows like some of the Law and Order. Some of the proceedings in Law and Order actually look like how the inside of a courtroom works from time to time. Suits is nothing like the real practice of law, but it's still fun to watch. Jag is so specialized with court martials, and that's an arena I've never played in, so I don't know, but I still enjoy watching them. My wife gets frustrated with me sometimes because I'm saying, well, that wouldn't happen, or that's not how any of this works.
Just enjoy the show, Nick.
Yeah. But I enjoy critiquing things, so I still get enjoyment out of it.
Yeah. Let's get back to some questions at hand here. So how can they appeal to any crime that was not already tried and convicted for? Aren't we innocent until proven guilty? I think this is specifically the jury instructions maybe they're talking about.
Yeah, that's the crux of what makes this so hard to swallow, I think, is this is all based on a jury deciding that he had the intent to commit or did commit another crime that he wasn't on trial for, and there was no burden of proof or standard of reasonable doubt applicable to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another one from Mind Trap here. If you suggest that my underlying crime of murder, aren't you also trying me for murder? That was.
Yeah, I think that's the same general idea.
Yeah. And that therein lies the problem of, hey, the indictment wasn't about this crime, but we're going to try you for this anyway. Right.
Well, and even a little bit. Yes. Yes and no. So some of the underlying crimes that they look to as unlawful means for the New York election statute were federal. So the New York state prosecutor would not have jurisdiction to prosecute violations of federal criminal law. So not only were those underlying alleged unlawful acts not tried as separate charges, there was no jury that decided that the former president was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt on those charges. Some of them could never have been tried in the forum that they were tried in. You don't get a trial on a federal crime in a state court. They don't have jurisdiction over it.
So is that an issue of reversible error as well, or potential one?
It depends on how an appellate court looks at this and what New York law has provided on either this statute or similar statutes. I don't know the answer to that for sure. It seems like there will be something that's reversible error in how that instruction was put together, and what was required to be found or not required to be found. But it wouldn't be the first time that there are various laws that have an element of committing another act that could have been a crime that don't require the same guilt beyond a reasonable doubt standard for the underlying act. I can't come up with a great example off the top of my head, but that's not a foreign concept. It's a strange concept in the law, though.
Let's get to the final two, and then we'll get to something else. We talked about this briefly, but let's revisit it. It says, Nicholas, what do you think of Josh's point about clear charges? How much about the legal system is ever clear to lay people? This is why they say nothing is more expensive than a cheap attorney. That's fair.
I think some things are clear to lay people. If you're on trial for murder, everybody knows what murder is. I think some of what that comes down to on the clear charges, and you can correct me if you're wrong or if I'm wrong here, Josh, but we want we want to have enough clarity that we can follow along and understand what's going on. But in something like this, I think part of the reason it feels so off is this is not murder. It's not rape. It's not actually defrauding people and causing financial harm. It's, at the end of the day, political gamesmanship. He was prosecuted for political gamesmanship. And that is murky in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think that actually goes to what I was talking about. That's exactly right, as well. And then last one for now. Here it is. So now they're putting us on the jury, which is not fair because none of us were in the courtroom. A question for all: do you believe Trump is guilty or not, and how confident are you in that belief? Regardless of your answer to that, if Trump is in fact guilty, what would you say should happen? So questions there.
My first question is guilty of what?
Same question.
Yeah. So
guilty of something?
Yeah.
Well, I'm guilty of something too, but I want to know exactly. And I think, Josh, this gets to your point of clarity. We see so many people, even on social media and cable news and everything else, going out and talking about how Trump is guilty. And I've just been asking people, tell me, what's he guilty of specifically? And rarely do I even get an attempt at a clear answer.
Yeah. And for me, it's also, you're talking about a law issue. Now, if you're asking me if he's guilty of being an immoral dirtbag, hey, I'm right along there with you. But unfortunately, or fortunately, it's not illegal to be an immoral dirtbag if you're not breaking the law in our country. And so, do I think he slept with Stormy Daniels and paid her off, even though he denies that he did? I think there's like a 99% chance that he did that, right?
At least 51. Somewhere between there.
So I think he's guilty of that. Now, do I think he's guilty of the charges being levied? I'm not even sure I understand the charges that are being levied. And that's where I would sit if I was in that jury room. Now, again, I wasn't in the whole process, but the way the jury instructions, there was a reason the jury asked for them again to be explained to them, because it was so confusing. And to me, I'm just kind of like, well, I don't know, but I know that I think he's innocent until proven guilty, and I don't know that it's even remotely possible to prove him guilty of these things without some sort of paper trail that maybe they saw. I don't know, but that I'm not aware of.
It hasn't been. Yeah.
If he's guilty of some form of broken law, he should be held accountable.
So should everybody else in politics that has done similar things, or
everybody else in general, right?
That would drain the swamp. I mean, if talk about draining the swamp. If Trump is guilty, he should be convicted, and so should everybody else.
Okay, so the non-lawyers went on this question first.
If gun to my head, I have to pick: is he guilty or not? Do I believe that? I do not personally believe he's guilty of the crime that was charged. How confident am I of that? Not very. I'm sitting on the sidelines. I wasn't on the pitch. But from everything that I've seen, strictly from a legal analysis, I think the easiest breakdown for me is on 2 points. One, I think he was a politician playing political games, just like every politician who slept with a porn star and needed to pay her off so she didn't testify or tell people. I don't think that's an unlawful means to sway an election. And I don't think that this doesn't look like fraud to me. The only people you could talk about defrauding are the voters. And the voters would have never seen this and didn't see this prior to the election. So On those grounds, based on what I know, I would say not guilty if I had to vote without all the information. If he is guilty, if this conviction stands, then he ought to be sentenced according to the same considerations that anyone else convicted of this would be sentenced under. I really don't want to see a former president in prison especially over something like this, because that's just a little too just gag reflex banana republic for me. But that being said, if this is a particular charge that people are normally sentenced to prison for, then I don't think that he should get special treatment on account of being a former president.
I think that's well said and fair. And I want our viewers to remember that you have been opposed to voting for Trump in the last 2 elections. And so this seems, I mean, you pushed back against things I've said, but at the end of the day, you're like, hey man, if I'm on that jury, I don't think he's guilty of what he's been accused of. No,
and I'll just to flesh that out a little. I've never told anyone who I'm voting for or who I did vote for.
You told me. That's our secret.
Yesterday, I was in my closet. Didn't count.
He only told you who he didn't vote for. He didn't tell you who he voted for.
No, he actually.
Oh, okay.
But that is not something I publicly announce. As I mentioned, like follow politics, but I do my best to stay above the fray, or stay out of the fray, whether that's above, below, beside, wherever. But no, I have never registered a vote, tallied a vote in favor of Donald Trump. What I do in this next election is a great mystery that I won't be revealing today. But I have never particularly wanted to sign my name on the line, metaphorically speaking, in favor of a man that I don't have much respect for. That doesn't have much to do with how I think he's governed when given the chance. I'm not, as you mentioned, I certainly lean conservative. In a different world where things weren't so polarized, I'd probably still be an independent. I have voted split tickets in multiple elections. I have no loyalty to a party, but the lines are being drawn a little more clearly now than perhaps they were 20 years ago when I voted for the first time.
Yep.
That's good. That's good. Thanks again, Nick. I want to close our time together by talking about 2 things. One is, as Christians, as we all profess belief in Jesus Christ here, how do we respond to this? Because there are a lot of hot takes that we could have one way or the other. There are people that Nick, regardless of what you just said, the fact that you said you would say Trump is not guilty is going to throw you in a bucket with a lot of other people when they clip that out and they put it out there. How do we respond as Christians to this? And how do we talk about it to other people? What are some thoughts, Tim and Nick, on that? And then I'll give some thoughts.
Go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say you go first. Age before beauty.
Oh yeah. All right.
Age before Viking beauty. Yes. You both look kind of like Vikings, by the way. I don't. So. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right, Josh, rephrase the question for me.
Yeah.
Or summarize it again.
Basically, how as Christians should we be thinking about this, and how should we be talking about it? Yeah.
Okay. Well, for me, it comes down to the article that you and I wrote, Josh, before all of this happened. I think the title of that article was "A Moral Obligation to Vote for an Immoral Candidate." And as Christians, we're, I think of the 2 greatest commands: to love God and to love our neighbors, to love everybody, from our neighbors to our enemies, to those who would consider us to be enemies. And for me, that's what drives me in all of this, is loving my neighbors. And who is my neighbor? Well, it's my next door neighbor. It's anybody I interact with. And really, ultimately, I think Jesus is saying, love the world. Right? For God so loved the world. And yes, I do believe that means every single person. And so with the idea of loving humanity in mind, I believe that is the objective purpose, God's creative intent, that he created humanity on purpose and for the specific purpose to love everybody. And that everybody is supposed to be in a love relationship with each other and with God in perfect harmony. And in heaven, it's going to be like that. But here we're called to try to make it as close to that as possible, knowing that we're going to fall short, but we still have to try. That's what honors God when we try to love our neighbors. So, man, that's what drives me, is what is best for my neighbor. I did on social media this morning. I told a guy that I thought he was being selfish because he was like, I don't need a politician to stand up for me because look at all of his moral failings. And I said, it's not about you then, but it is, and it's not about me. It's about my neighbor. And I really think that if our country goes down the road of this banana republic, and the more influence we get by Marxist ideas, which we're swimming in right now, I think it will destroy everything good about this nation and be horrible for my neighbors. And so that's what drives me as a Christian. I'm seeking, Scripture is clear when it talks about love, that love always protects. I am seeking to protect my neighbors. And even Donald Trump is my neighbor. And I agree with Nick. I don't think that he is guilty of what he was charged with. And so because I love my neighbor, I feel this injustice has been done, and we have to speak truth to power. And, I've had people say, Tim, the more you speak about these political things, the more you're going to push people away from your ministry and all these other good things that you're doing theologically and philosophically. And I said, so be it. The truth is like a fire shut up in my bones. And for the sake of my neighbors, I cannot be quiet about these things. I mean, Josh, our new mission of Free Thinking Ministries is to equip the curious to reason together, Isaiah 1:18, by applying logic and sound theology to all aspects of life. And this is a huge aspect of life. And so I'm trying my hardest to think logically and theologically about this. And I care about truth and justice. And so I'm going to speak about this. And I'm willing to be wrong. But right now, this is, I believe I'm speaking truth on this. And I'm glad to be sharpened by guys like you. So anyway, ultimately for me, how do I apply Christianity to this? I'm thinking about my neighbors.
Okay. Nick, anything you want to say from your perspective on that?
Well, man, I shouldn't have made Tim go first. I don't know that I followed that very well. For me, a verse that I come back to a lot in Romans 12 is, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Don't repay evil for evil. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I know I kind of bookended that, but there is a space. I'm thankful for the work that you guys are doing and the way that you're engaging with people. It's not the way that I engage with people. I enjoy coming and poking your arguments sometimes on social media.
Yeah.
Did I mention attorneys like to argue?
That's why we're friends.
But that's what it comes back to for me. Is as much as it depends on me, I want to live at peace with all men, and not only because that's what Scripture literally tells us to do, but the way that I envision and apply that is I probably won't be talking about this trial or the results too much. I certainly wouldn't have been talking about it today if Tim hadn't have asked me my opinion. So I would much, I think a lot of those issues that you two focus on with the critical social justice and cultural Marxism that we're facing as a country, the misalignment of values when it comes to favoring politics over faith, and you know, the emphasis on building up and employing a theologically, doctrinally sound worldview to the events that happen around us. Those are very important things. I tend to, you know, have a lot more one-on-one conversations behind the scenes. I think we probably have the same goals. We just go about it differently. But I tend to avoid the really divisive stuff in hopes that reconciliation happens through a shared worldview and a better understanding of the issues that we face, such that I try very hard and have to fight against being blinded by my own value bias, where I assume that anyone who disagrees with me or votes differently than me or has a different perspective must be my opposite, when sometimes they just value a particular thing higher than I value that thing, and vice versa. So I think going forward for me and for Christians who aren't so out in front as you guys are, and kind of on the front lines of some of those public battles, there's a whole lot that Christians can do daily, no matter how they feel about this trial and its results, to continue to come together around the Word of God and around that sound doctrine and sound theology, and just focusing back on the cross. And I think that minimizes, in the long run, so many of the societal problems that we have.
That's great. That's
well,
great.
I think we need to hear a lot more from Nicholas Norton. Not on this trial or anything, but just on what you said. So, Nick, you have an open invitation to come back on our show anytime.
And maybe we'll critique Suits or something like that.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I've got thoughts.
Yeah. I'll add my 2 cents here. I'm actually going to put a rubber stamp on what both of you said. I think we need people to be vocal, and we also need people to do one-on-one conversations. And when you're out in front, sometimes those don't come as easily because people see you on a screen saying things, and they assume on a screen what you say on a screen is the way you're going to act in a personal one-on-one conversation. But I'm going to focus a little bit on what we shouldn't do as well as Christians, especially people who lean towards the conservative side. And I'm actually going to share my screen here because this is an example of something I think we shouldn't do. Ryan Fournier, I don't know exactly who he is. I think he works in politics. But he says, Jesus, Paul, Peter, Thomas, John, and all of the disciples were also found guilty. This is in response to what happened with Donald Trump. First, I want to say I understand what he's trying to say here. I think this is a gross misrepresentation of what we should say as Christians. Donald Trump is not an apostle. Donald Trump is not Jesus. Donald Trump is not being accused of proclaiming the gospel in the face of opposition. He's being accused of something else, and whether or not that trial is fair, and I don't believe that it was fair, it does not put him in martyr category. And I don't want to make him a messiah or a martyr or the answer to all of our problems. I have a lot of issues with Donald Trump. I have talked about them a lot. People tend to not believe me that I've talked about them a lot because they've also heard me defend the man. But I think as Christians, we have these sometimes, and as people, we have this desire to have a knee-jerk reaction. And that tweet, I think, is an example of a knee-jerk reaction. I don't want to put Trump in the same sentence as the men who died for the cause of the gospel. Trump is not dying for the cause of the gospel. Trump was accused of something, still not entirely sure what it was, and then he was convicted of that thing. And I do believe injustice occurred. But it's not because he was preaching the gospel. It's not because he's a Christian. It's not because he's fighting for Christian values. What he was fighting for was his ability to pay off somebody he slept with.
A porn star.
Do not put that in the same realm. So as Christians, I think we need to avoid that knee-jerk reaction, recognize that we can still call truth without putting a rubber stamp on all of the behavior that happened through someone like Donald Trump or something like that. So as the caveat to say, I agree with what both of you guys said and what you said, but I wanted to throw that out there as well. Before we end here, I do want to pull up one more just quote here because I appreciate this from Mindtrap. He says, "Thanks for taking the questions. Challenging to frame them in short form, but y'all fielded them well and got the intent beyond the awkward wording. Thanks." Appreciate that. Appreciate that, Mindtrap. And Nick, I want to appreciate you and thank you for coming on. I learned actually a ton from this conversation. It was very helpful. So thank you for speaking clearly and breaking it down for people who don't necessarily swim in those waters.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys for inviting me here today. I've enjoyed this.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, we'll have to do something like this again when it is not nearly as volatile. But thank you. And as we always say at Free Thinking Ministries, God bless and stay reasonable.
Stay reasonable. Nick, you missed it. Come on.
I can't even find